Good morning, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you here at the Swedish House of Finance at the second day of the academic part of the AI conference. And we have a great lineup of the papers, so without any further ado, let's just start. And it's my pleasure to welcome Jillian Grennan, who is going to join us by Zoom. Jillian is from Santa Clara University, UC Berkeley, and she does a very topical research in fintech. She studies how AI and the new technologies are changing the nature of financial services. Jillian is going to present her paper, Artificial Intelligence and High-Skilled Work, Evidence from Analysts. Jillian, you have 25 minutes. The virtual floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm really excited to be able to share this paper with all of you. This is work joint with Ronnie McKaylee at Hong Kong University. So with a whole conference on the topic, I don't really have to go into our big motivation, but I do think it's worth pointing out some of the ways in which the prediction and exploration that AI brings us is helping to really change the world and change it because it's a general purpose technology. And finance happens to be at the forefront of AI adoption. And because of that, AI is being used in a variety of applications. I'm sure you probably heard about it yesterday, from, trustless trade execution to back testing to intelligence signals. AI is being used in finance. And despite the enthusiasm for AI, I think uncertainty really remains. And that uncertainty remains about how traditional factors of production, so labor and capital, are actually going to change as a result of AI. There's some who would say that AI is actually going to displace high-skilled workers, while others would say AI is just irrelevant. It's just a capital deepening technology. And so in this study, we really try and take this tension to heart and look at it through the lens of observable data. And by focusing on a single profession, we may lose a little bit of generalizability. We're looking at analysts in the financial context, but I would argue financial analysts are one of the gatekeepers of financial markets. They're who people go to for recommendations, for information still. And so we think they're a really important person to study. We use, when we're going after it, what exactly is the question that we're going after? It is this substitutes versus complements. It's this quote by Joyce Chang. Now that's actually a few years old, but I still feel that it really captures the moment, which is with 80% of the data in the world created in the last 2 years, judgment matters more than ever. Technology is a complement to sound judgment and knowledge, not a substitute. And so she was very much on the belief that it's a complement, that maybe it's going to even expand jobs for high-skilled workers. What we're going to do is sort of really look at this with this focus that's deep. We're going to be able to look at task-specific data, which is rare for analysts, and separate it out and try and understand, these tasks that take time to get your job done, but ultimately how the mix of tasks might change. And perhaps maybe we're focusing a little bit more on, our social skills, or a little bit more on other skills that we might have. So just to preview some of our main findings, we find that AI does not fully replace analysts, but it does change the job. And in changing the job, it's reducing the total number of analysts. So there is some evidence of substitution. There are fewer analysts per stock. We see more leaves, fewer entry, and those that stay shift the coverage to stocks requiring what we're going to call more soft skills. And we also see, though, some evidence of the complementary hypothesis. So analysts do turn to these soft skills. They increase meetings with management and institutional investors, and they change the type of questions they ask on earnings calls. And then what I think is really cool, whether it's these studies of manufacturing and some other studies, you don't often get to see product quality, but we get to see product quality in this setting. And we see that the prediction actually improves. So the product quality, the analyst reports are improving. The consensus report improves, but there's a heterogeneous response effect by individual analysts. So it's really interesting if you look at the full distribution of analysts, you really are getting this top, those in the like upper 25th percentile are getting actually so much better that it's bringing up the whole distribution, whereas those in the middle are not necessarily getting better. And this is sort of consistent with the effort. We look at evidence on effort, and we find mixed results there. Finally, we have some indirect evidence on compensation. So we can look at announcement returns when they're changing their recommendation and stuff like that. And so we have some indirect evidence consistent with this idea of decreased compensation. And so decreased compensation is commonly a hypothesis that comes out from this literature that would suggest that, technology is a substitute for human labor. So I'm going to give you, I know you got a lot of it yesterday, but I'm going to give you a little bit of my taste on what my interpretation of the AI and asset management literature. So I think the one we sort of all know that investors are using AI to do what analysts had already been doing. They're rapidly expanding what fintechs do. Ronnie and I have a paper on sort of many ways that fintechs synthesize data and use AI to make recommendations. And I think they're doing this because it's so hard to process data without the help of AI. There's so much data out there, and especially, even in sectors like ESG or sectors that you wouldn't think necessarily need that much data, that you do. You have so much to parse and so much to look through. And so this challenge really means all investors must rely on all data. And so evidence from fintechs show that investors rely on AI signals, and it's not just the most sophisticated investors. We're seeing it adopted from retail investors to hedge funds and beyond. This is older, but this is also consistent with the time period in our study. This prediction shows that asset managers rely on AI and alt data. This was showing sort of this total spend, but also where most of the data is coming from, which is web scraping, social sentiment, and sort of that type of information. Email, receipt, and satellite is a little bit lower. We actually did a survey as part of our study. This is one of the updated things that we've added to the study, and can speak to that a little bit more on what data some of the analysts thought was useful. Ultimately, the factors that we think influencing AI adoption in finance is this data abundance. So the fact that we can quantify more things. It's computing ease. Data processing is simply less costly. Okay. And it's algorithmic improvements. This one seems to very much hold when I talk to some asset managers that you can, it's not about actually the biggest and the best change in technology. It's actually more about the stability, that the predictions out of sample are getting much more stable, and so it's easier to train models. It's data integrity. The data quality has enhanced as the streamlined process has ensured that essentially garbage in, garbage out is gone or limited. It's competition, and this is what I think is one of those really unique things about the finance industry. So some of these other factors are sort of there anywhere. But given that informational efficiency is really paramount in finance and security markets, the idea that there's a first mover advantage here, okay, and startups are bringing it to the market, and so incumbents have to do it. It is not that you can sit around and sort of ignore what's going on or buy up those firms and then put them out of business. And so, in that sense, this competition is going to drive it, and we're going to look a little bit at the competition, and then just open sources. Basically, you can see in the TensorFlow data, basically the day it got released, and then the time period afterwards of the jobs data, how people started moving around more. And so we just try to incorporate these insights into our testing of our hypotheses by looking at sort of a proxy for data abundance, a proxy for computational ease, and sort of a proxy for competition. Okay. And I would argue that, yes, fintech and AI are changing asset management. I think it's a broader question. And so I will leave it to everybody who's smart in the audience to help us in answering that. So let me get into our hypotheses, which are about AI and high-skilled work. So AI's impact is potentially different, and I think it's really can be divided up into the low skilled, medium skilled, and high skilled. So traditionally, when we think of robots, it was substituting for manual tasks up to a threshold. But basically, Amazon bought a bunch of warehouse robots, but at some point in time, because it was cheaper to do that, you could actually invest more in other parts, and we saw evidence that labor actually expanded. Software was this idea that, oh, it's actually substituting for sort of a back office task with low stakes. So this is not a life or death situation. This is the fact that, okay, we're getting a bunch of marketing, and if they send me a bad advertisement on my Google search, it's not the end of the world. And then AI is basically substituting for non-routine for production tasks. So this is the image recognition. This is writing reports. This is stock prediction. This is, as we've now seen with artwork recently, a lot of the guys using Dolly and putting their pieces out there, and the whole artist industry saying, no, you can't do that. What about artists? So I think that's great. So how is it in sell-side analysts? Remember, what they usually did or used to do was research reports, earnings estimates, their recommendation. Mind you, their unique value proposition to investors is uncovering new info. And so typically a US analyst is considered part of a cost center, right? The employers profit only indirectly through the increased trading volume that analyst may be able to bring to their firm. And so in this sense, analyst compensation is related to abnormal trading volume. That's something that we look at when we try and get a compensation. So what analyst tasks, what can machines do? When we look at the popular SML, which is Brynjolfsson at Stanford's measure of sort of how replaceable is your job, they're only above average. Analyst tasks that AI can do specifically is sort of processing these alt data, useful for short-term predictions, and updating valuation models, and to an extent possible writing reports. What they can't do is largely economic interpretability of the predictions of long-term trends, extending or explaining findings to clients, and gathering soft information, which in our interviews, people really described as, it's your ear to the ground. What are you doing on Wall Street? How many contacts do you have? How much can you arbitrage between what the different contacts are saying? And so this is sort of some of the interview evidence we had. They said, entry into and exit from the job, has it changed as a result of AI? And we've heard yes. A resounding, brokers seek atypical backgrounds now. Sort of everyone is, the glass ceiling is broken. It also changes exit. And that's sort of given that every company sort of has a tech angle now, analysts get exposed to all aspects of the business. And so that opens the door to more corporate and IR roles. Is AI changing the nature of the job? This is where we got yes, but there's more nuance. It was really the mega and large caps. AI is pretty accurate at prediction for these stocks with a few well-established metrics that everybody has data for. Whereas small and mid caps, they thought AI was less accurate for, and there's still too many variables that are not well populated. And so those are the ones where really the legwork or the sort of soft information still matters. Is AI pushing forecast horizons shorter or longer? So this one I know has come up theoretically in the literature. We got to know forecast horizon depends on who your primary client is. And so if you have a long duration client, that's why that's your forecast. Will AI replace you? We also got no, which I appreciated people saying, autopilot will never replace pilots. It just changed their jobs. And so they had a strong view that AI is complementary and sort of it will help maybe set the risk parameters, but it's not going to replace them. Mind you, these are interview evidence. What we're going to take it to and do is sort of the data. And mind you, from investors' perspective, some of the sort of prediction quant stuff out of analysts, it was not the most popular. This was an institutional investor magazine saying earnings and stock selection were low. So what does the data actually show us? Well, in our context, I just have to tell you about our proxies. So our first proxy, data abundance, we use the number of social media posts, okay, in a given quarter. Data abundance is thought to matter even if analysts don't pay attention to it, because of why? It's making it harder to trade, right? Data is always going to get incorporated into prices, and which Ronnie and I showed in a separate paper. And so this is going to make it harder for analysts to bring value add. We proxy for computational ease. using SEC download data to identify crawlers and bots in the process. And then finally, we proxy for remaining AI, sort of using employer-specific investments via fintech AI and AI firm acquisitions, as well as data licensing arrangements. And this is a novel data set on data licensing, which I didn't know how many banks actually license data from Facebook and the likes of that. So we're going to use an instrument to try and go after causality. Our idea is really focused on the data abundance. So short news headlines often attract attention. Yay, I've got an idea. But that actually ultimately leads to you reposting and reposting with a comment. Those comments actually have informational value. And that is really what we're going after. This idea of the quasi-random variation attributable to the length of a headline that might force you to pay attention and create more data. So we want this good data, this data abundance that is random rather than data abundance that might just be occurring because everybody likes to talk about Tesla. Okay. Our exclusion restriction, we went to a bunch of tests. It seems to pass some of the basics of exclusion restriction. And so I feel confident in it, but you can look at the paper for those details. Testing and substitutes hypothesis, what we see is fewer stocks per analyst when social media data is abundant. We also see it in the computational ease variable because of the various fixed effects here. This is not one where we can, because these are basically analyst stock level ones rather than just at the analyst level. We can't really look at some of that, how the AI investment is playing into this. Okay. And so our standard areas are clustered at the stock level, but we do see fewer analysts per stock. And so then our next goal is to really decompose this effect and understand where it's coming from. Is it coming from analysts leaving the profession? Is it coming from less entry? All of those types of questions. And as you can see, our F-stat is rather large. Our T-stat on our instrument is large. And so we feel confident, and it's both in the cross-section and within stock over time. So this is the extensive margin. We see that analysts are quitting their jobs. This is the substitute hypothesis best direct evidence we have. And we can see that data abundance is associated with quits, sort of probably as expected, but a little bit at the same time, we saw AI data acquisitions. Maybe you have this belief, oh, my firm actually has this like competitive advantage now. There's less quits associated with firm-specific investment in AI. But it's actually the size and the magnitude of the effect is much larger from this data abundance. Same thing with that. And then this is one of the ones that was more surprising to us initially, and sort of might tell you about our whole distribution results. The accurate analysts are the ones quitting. Okay. So we're going to sort of explore more to understand this out. Accurate, though, does not necessarily mean who institutional investors like. So we also look at all-star analysts in the paper. I didn't put it up here, and we don't see all-star analysts leaving. Okay. So those might be the people with soft skills. Our tests are 5 minutes. Okay, our tests are pretty robust. I just want to show you some of the pictures. This is the analyst quitting over time. So you can see it is a much higher quit rate than even before a period. And so where do they go? And so we looked up analysts on LinkedIn to understand, and they were going to sort of buy-side corporate roles, asset management, what you would expect. But what's really cool is that we can look at research versus non-research roles. And we really see that they're actually over time not going to research roles and increasingly leaving for non-research roles. And so this led us to sort of also look at the background. This one, I remember when I first saw this photo. And this is basically who's actually, percent with MBAs leaving. And we're not seeing the people with MBAs leaving now. But we used to see, sort of higher percentage of MBAs leaving. And I was like, why is this? And then it just dawned on me that MBAs are super socially connected, that they are the guys who, are there. And it made me feel very good about my job as teaching a bunch of MBAs, that they will, our job is still going to be there. The people who are still doing the work, who are still very good at what they do, are the socially connected people who need that environment to make those connections. And so, this is just a little bit more of that, so I'll move on. We switch and look at the next question, which is sort of intensive versus extensive margin. What stocks are they covering? And we see that data abundance is associated with analysts being less likely to initiate coverage on that stock. We see data abundance. This is now switching the other direction. They are also more likely to stop covering stocks with high data abundance. And all of these specifications, we have a full set of stock, analyst, and news content controls. So as evidence, our substitution channel, career switching, especially among top talent, and stock coverage moves away from the high AI stocks. So now we're going to move to this complementary task hypothesis. This is where we're really going after hard versus soft skills. And so how are we going to do that? So we've improved our textual analysis of analyst questions, and we've labeled their questions into sort of these hard to measure versus easy to measure topics. And so what we're showing you is from earnings calls, and it suggests that basically this data abundance is associated with analysts asking more questions. Their question length is longer by total words. But what we see is a reduction in sort of easy to measure questions. So a reduction in questions about sales, but an increase in measure and hard to measure topics. So questions about engagement, the culture, sort of those things that you really have to understand, pricing strategies. And so as a second test of it, so this is just what they're asking questions. What are they talking about? What is that like sort of information they're trying to get? We also can see it in the meetings. And so this data set we look at, we see the meetings suggest they're spending more time in total meetings and with management and institutional investors. And this is a really nice one because it's actually not that many more. It's like roughly one more meeting more per month relative to stuff, but over time that actually adds up. And this one I heard from them a lot in the interviews. If I didn't emphasize that part of our interviews, they agreed with us that they are spending more face time than they ever have before. So this is fine.
1 minute.
Oh. All right, so this is finally getting into the earnings stuff where we sort of see a mixed set of results. Bias, it seems like it's going down. Accuracy is improving. The boldness of the forecast may be a bit increasing, which would suggest effort, but it's not, the distribution sometimes changes. So we think this is attributable, though, in our additional appendix analysis to the long-term labor composition changes. Finally, I will say that when we look at the compensation evidence, this is sort of abnormal returns. We see evidence that both volume and excess returns are lower, which would suggest lower pay. So in conclusion, given everything that's going on with AI and how is it going to affect incumbent workers, we find that the future work for these high-skilled workers is probably going to focus more on their soft skills as their analytics advantage declines. So some analysts, especially talented ones, might leave the profession, but the change in talent may offset some of the initial improvements in product quality. And our limitation is while sell-side analysts share characteristics with many high-skilled workers, it may not generalize beyond finance in this setting, but I think it's nevertheless, because of the analyst role as gatekeepers in the profession, is a really important profession to study. And thank you. I know I got sick, and I really appreciate everybody dealing with me last minute getting sick. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much. And now we have a discussion. And the discussion is by Xing Huang from Washington University. Xing, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. And so let me now talk about this paper, because I think this is unlike a lot of other large-scale studies. This paper actually, so they try to embrace they really try to embrace the details. So they give us a richly detailed portrait of the impact of AI through this lens of security analyst. And as Jill already mentioned, of course, this is trying to looking at a very specific context, so we may lose some of the generalizability. However, I actually think the richness of the details is very instructive, and the way I try to see this, how this adds value, is to help us really figure out what are the key components in the conceptual framework for us to think about the impact of AI, and also how can we measure the relevant components in this context. And at the end, the results actually are quite aligned with our general understanding. The impact of AI is about rebundling tasks of analysts. So if we think about occupation, it's actually a bundle of tasks. So instead of just thinking about whether this is optimistic or pessimistic about the future of work, we actually try to think about this as rebundling task of analysts. And there are both substitution and complementarity. And I think when we really look at a specific context, actually this brings some complexity. And just to flesh out the complexity, here I want to set the stage for this discussion. Let me talk about a little bit about the framework so that we can see all the moving parts here. And I think Jill actually covered most of this. So basically, when we think about the main task of the equity research team, that is prediction, and there is a quantitative part, and there is also the interpretation of the prediction. And analysts, in addition, they also communicate with clients or management. So if we think about among these tasks, the one which is most suitable for AI actually is the quantitative part, and especially the easy to measure components. And I think AI actually starts dabbing into the other tasks as well. So we have like AI supporting interpretation as well as facilitate communication. But just to think about the scope of this paper, actually we just focus on the quantitative prediction part. And to focusing on that part, let's look at the input. The input, there is public information, so that includes structured disclosures as well as unstructured alternative data. There is also private information, and not only in sell-side analysts actually compete in this space, there are also a lot of other newly developed fintech firms like the social media crowdsourcing and also independent AI prediction. And the input and as well as the competition, they will affect the value of prediction, and that will affect the task of rebundling. That will further affect the demand of the skill set from the analysts. And we can think about there are two types of skills. One is the data analytical skills, which can be either AI related or non-AI related, and there is also the soft skill. So I think the key of this research actually, and also the main challenge, is trying to find the measurement for all the relevant components. And really kudos to the authors. They put together a very amazingly granular data. Not only they have multiple measures for AI, they also have very granular data for the task so that they can look at the impact on task rebundling along with the impact on analyst career choices. So as I think the measure is super important in this type of research. So I will spend a fair amount of time talk about the measures. So what they actually capture, what else they may capture, and whether this can lead, this may lead to some alternative interpretation. And then I want to think about whether there may be some alternative measures for AI, and also whether we can think about some hypotheses which is more AI specific. So to talk about the measure of AI, so the main measure in this paper is the data abundance, which is measured by the number of social media posts. I think this is a very natural source for us to think about alternative data. However, let's also think about what else it may capture. So the first thing coming in mind is retail popularity. So the bloggers, they actually tend to post more when the stocks are more popular among retail investors. So think about GameStop last year. When there is the stock trading frenzy, you can see the seeking alpha post actually surged and followed by the decrease of the analyst coverage. So that's kind of consistent with the evidence in the paper. But the alternative interpretation could be after the frenzy, the price is more driven by sentiment rather than fundamental. And because the value of fundamental research is reduced, and then analysts actually, they will move away from these stocks. And I think this is a very sensible interpretation. However, the problem is this is not related to AI. And the instrument may not help with this because shorter headline can also drive the retail popularity. So if the instrument is actually instrumenting for the retail popularity, that comes back to this non-AI interpretation. Social media posts can also, itself also one type of prediction. Of course, the bloggers, sometimes they also post their forecasts and also make recommendation, and they may also correlate with other crowdsourcing platform participation, like in on estimates. So actually, there is a literature talk about the impact from the competition from fintech, and I think Jill and Ronnie has a really nice paper on this topic. So now the question is whether the documented effects really capture the impact of AI or actually capture the impact of competition from fintech platforms. So based on this alternative interpretation, which may not be related to AI, I was thinking maybe we can think about some alternative ways to measure AI or explore some hypotheses that are more AI specific. So let's first think about alternative way to measure AI. And let's come back to these two measures, the first two measures in the paper. They're both measuring the input of the data of the AI. So one is measuring the supply of information, and the other is measuring the consumption of information. And in general, when we think about how AI affects analysts, that depends on how AI affects the cost and the quality of the prediction. So it's intuitive for us to think about the amount of information may reduce the cost of prediction. However, it may not necessarily increase the quality of the prediction. For example, for the stocks with low signal-to-noise ratio or short history, even we get more data, we may not get a better prediction. So in this case, it's not very straightforward for us to think about the impact of information on these labor outcomes. So an alternative way for us is to think about whether we can really measure the quality improvement that can be brought by AI. So what about measuring the benchmark improvement of AI-generated forecasts relative to some consensus? So this AI-generated forecasts could either be applying some standard machine learning algorithm to easily accessible public information, or can directly use readily available AI forecasts like the Smart Score from TPRANKS. And even we use this alternative measure for AI, they may still correlate with firm characteristics. So what I want to think next is whether we can actually explore some other hypotheses which are more related to AI. So one dimension is to think about the heterogeneous impact across different research teams. So the data may not, the data may be the new oil, but it still needs to be fueled by the engine, which is AI. So how data impacts the labor outcome actually will vary with how the research teams utilize AI. And here, the third measure, actually, they are measuring the AI adoption of the research teams. So, however, they are actually treating these three measures kind of in parallel. So the axis I'm talking about here is trying to interact AI adoption with the first two measures. When we think about the prediction for the AI-powered research teams, the complementarity will dominate the substitution. So we can think about the documented complementarity on the task rebundling actually will be stronger for the AI-powered team, but less or even insignificant for the human-driven team. Whereas for analyst coverage, the AI-powered research team, they may shift towards the stocks suitable for AI, whereas the human-driven team may shift away from the stocks suitable for AI. And not only in the AI engine may not only happen on the research team level, it can also happen on the analyst level. So here, if we think about the labor outcomes of analysts, we can also think about whether this vary with the analyst skill set. As I mentioned, the skill set may have two types of skills. One is the data analytical skill, including both AI and non-AI. The other is a soft skill, which can help make the information more accessible or facilitate the communication. So we can try to measure this skill set using the LinkedIn skills record data. So I know Jill already used some LinkedIn data to capture the job characteristics in the paper. So I wonder whether you also get access to this skill record data, which also uses some recent papers. So just to give some example here, this analyst A and B, they have some data analytical skills, but not AI related. But mostly they just have a lot of soft skills. Whereas for analyst C, this is more tilting towards the data analytical skills. And now it's also including some AI related skills like machine learning. And here analyst D, actually this is even more specialized in AI related skills. So I think there is a fair amount of variation in analyst skill set. And here we can think about the prediction, the stocks more suitable for AI that will demand AI-related skills and substitute for the non-AI-related skills and complement the soft skills. So in this case, the stocks which are more suitable for AI, if the analysts are covering those stocks, actually the analysts whose skill set are dominated by non-AI skill will be more likely to be displaced, or they would shift the coverage to stocks not suitable for AI. So I think in the paper, they actually already have some exercise along this line, but by directly measuring the skill set, I think that can just make the results sharper. So just to sum it up, I think this touches upon a cutting-edge topic, has amazing granular data, and has a lot of compelling evidence. And I like a quote which kind of echoes the theme from yesterday. So for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So I was very glad they actually didn't try to give us a simple answer, and actually they embrace the complexity. But I think it's important to embrace complexity without losing clarity. And hopefully some of the thoughts could be helpful. And thanks for bearing with my voice. And sorry about that, but thank you, everyone. And I will just stop here.
Thank you very much, Tim. And apologies for technical issues. We're going to fix it after the break. But for now, I think this microphone works. So let's hear some questions for Jillian, if you have any. Jillian, do you want to take some comments on Xing's discussion?
Yeah, I thought the discussion was great. I really liked some of the thoughts about using the SMART score as a way to get at sort of the interactions and some of those things that you were bringing up. I would say for the audience, we do put in sort of institutional ownership as a control. So you do have a sense of roughly the retail investors in the stock, although in the momentum. But I agree. If you have a proxy that you'd love me to throw in, I'm happy to put it in. I don't think it's necessarily GameStop. I think that is actually more of a recent phenomenon. And you have to remember, just because of the way that IBIS redid their data, we're actually limited on how far we can extend the sample forward. So we're missing some of the most recent years. But I thought it was a great discussion and I really appreciate the effort. And if you're just losing your voice, I'm very sorry for you. I have basically went through like 3 weeks without my voice, so it's a little tough. So I hope you feel better soon. And, thank you guys again for allowing me to participate. It was like a super cool conference.
Okay, thank you very much.